Hello, everyone, and welcome to Interview with an Architect. Today we have Anthony Harris with us. Anthony, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Um, hey, thank you for inviting me. This is pretty exciting to be a part of. My name is Anthony Harris, as you mentioned. I'm an architect here in Washington, D.C. I work at Gensler. I have been at Gensler for about 7 years now. Spent most of that time in the New York office and the last 2 years in the Gensler DC office, where I've worked on healthcare projects and some sort of large public projects as well.
Great. Okay, well, to get us started, what got you interested in the field of architecture?
Um, that's funny. I think I've been interested in architecture for about as long as I can remember, since when I was a kid. And I think even before I really knew or understood that, my interest had a name, and it was and it was architecture. Growing up, I was always really interested in sports. I love playing sports. I love watching sports. And I remember the first time that my dad took me to a baseball game. As I remember, as I said, I grew up here in DC, and this is before the Washington Nationals were a thing. So the local team was the Baltimore Orioles, and my dad took me for a trip up to Baltimore to see an Orioles game. And I remember walking through the turnstiles and just being completely blown away. I thought it was really beautiful, and seeing all the people that you don't get to focus on when you're watching the game on TV. It was a completely different experience. The grass was greener, it seemed sunnier. You could smell the popcorn. It was just like a really, really wonderful experience. And I really realized that I enjoyed being in big public spaces with tons of people around. And I felt like I could have stayed in that stadium all day long and just had the baseball game as a backdrop. And that sort of memory sort of stayed with me. And because I always, as I continue to watch sports on TV, I would always be interested in the stadiums and seeing what cool, innovative things were happening, with the backdrop of the games, essentially. And so I remember, being really into the Olympics as a kid, because you get to see all the cool venues that would be rolled out. And that stayed with me for a while. And again, at this point, I think I didn't really quite understand that that's what my interest was, right? Like being interested in, granted, it was one specific building type, but being interested in buildings and, sort of how they're designed, like that's architecture. And at that point, I started to, doodle and sketch stadiums and sporting venues on my own. And it continued, until I got to middle school, and I had this really interesting sort of experience and opportunity. As I mentioned, I grew up here in DC, and my middle school became a part of this program where an architect would visit your school and sort of speak to you about architecture. You get to do, some sort of small program, some sort of small project. And I realized, in looking back, I think this must have been like one of the first class or the first years of the architecture in the schools program. And the person who came to our school was wonderful, and he kind of helped me connect the dots that, this interest that I had in this one particular building type, and just big public spaces in general. Well, that's architecture, and so it's stayed with me since. And so yeah, that's kind of how I got interested in architecture.
Oh, that's great. So you kind of talked a little bit about your interest in public spaces. So did that lead you to somebody that inspired you, and who would that be?
Well, the funny thing is, I don't know that it got me interested in any one person in particular, but it did get me really interested in those types of, I guess, building typologies, you would say. And so I really love being in the DC subway for that reason, because it was like one of the few places where you had a big collection of people from, all different types coming together in one place. And it seemed like a really interesting sort of place. Like it didn't look like a cookie cutter sort of place that a young teenager, that I associated with, what buildings, are supposed to look like. And I also love visiting museums. The East Gallery, the East Wing and the West Wing of the National Gallery of Art became some of my favorite spaces too. And so, of course, I guess one person early on then would be Ian Pei, right? Because I did learn that he, his firm anyway, designed designed that wing, and so that got me really interested as well. And so, not so much individuals, I guess, at that point, individual architects. This was before I had, sort of an understanding of, who were some of the star architects and some of the names that I should know. But it was just individual buildings and types of spaces.
Great, great. Um, so how do you think architects make a difference in the world?
Well, it's funny. You'd be hard pressed to find a profession that's more impactful than architects, right? Architects literally shape the built environment and every sort of space that we inhabit. So, it's an extremely impactful profession, and that's exciting, and it brings a lot of opportunities. But also, it also brings it carries with it a lot of responsibility, right? I think everyone is sort of mindful of or or fearful of, if you're an architect, of having a building that leaks, or maybe something falls on someone, and that's really scary. And there's that sort of responsibility, but there's a responsibility of knowing that the things that you create actually impact how people engage and interact with each other, and it affects people's lives in a way that can be really long lasting, have these really big long-term ramifications on how we live as a society. So, I think it's important to really to lean into that and to be mindful of those things when we practice. And it's what make architecture, like I said, both exciting but really challenging at the same time.
That does sound very interesting. Something you probably have in the back of your mind a lot when you're designing things. Um, so what's your favorite part about being an architect?
Well, for the same reason that I talked about, the opportunity to get to design, these buildings and these spaces that have these big long lasting impacts on people. My favorite part about the profession is actually getting to see people engage with the projects that you design. And just knowing that something that you put out there into the world has really big social value, I guess. And I think about some of the projects that I've worked on. When I lived in New York, I worked on a library in this sort of immigrant neighborhood in Queens. And I remember sort of going to the project site just as the building was being completed, and like seeing some of the people who lived in the neighborhood starting to interact with the project and come to visit the building. There were people who were homeless. There were young teenagers who were using the internet in that building, because maybe that's their only place where they actually have access to the internet. And it made me feel like the work that I did was really important and impactful. And so, yeah, those are some of my favorite parts about being an architect, and some of my favorite stories in my career.
That's great. So a little bit, kind of a follow-up to that question is, how do you think history impacts architecture today?
Well, it's funny. I think that's a really, really good question. I think we're always living with our history, right? And where we are, like in the present moment, is informed by all the small things and all the lessons learned leading up to this point. And so, as an architect, and as people who just go about inhabiting space, we always learn those lessons. Sometimes those lessons come as a result of mistakes, and sometimes they come as a result of one-off successes that you then want to continue and replicate over and over again. And so history is always with us, like big picture wise, and those standalone projects that have such a big impact, go on to really change our thinking about how we design buildings. And the same with those mistakes, right? Like I talked earlier about like this challenge of having to sort of design spaces that are going to impact how we interact with each other. And there are times where we've, as a profession, have gotten that not so right. And so, you know, being humble enough to acknowledge those mistakes and then trying to correct for them in the way that we design spaces and our cities and our buildings is really, really critical.
So how do you see the world of architecture changing in 10, 20 years from now?
Oh, that's funny. And it's particularly funny now, like given how momentous, you know, some of the events that have happened, I think in the last three or 4 months. Um, I think the COVID pandemic, and then the social justice protests that we've had recently are gonna they're gonna have effects that are gonna be long lasting in our profession. I think they're gonna be we're gonna see these like really pivotal pivotal events that are going to change the way the profession sees itself, the way we educate architects and designers, and the way that we interact with our clients and the things that we prioritize. I think the really obvious thing is I think our profession is going to be more diverse and inclusive going forward. Part of that I think is just a thing of demographics, right? You look at the you know the makeup of the population who's going to be entering the profession in 10 and 20 years, and they're just a lot more diverse than you know previous generations were. So I think that's a big thing. And then also the profession has made a real concerted effort to include more voices, more women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I think that's going to redound to everyone's benefit, not just the profession, but the public at large. And then, of course, along with equity, environmental sustainability is going to have a really, really big role in the coming years. And it already has, like, the momentum has been sort of building, but I think it's gonna continue, and that trend is gonna tick up as it becomes a bigger and bigger issue that we're all gonna have to grapple with. So those, I think, are the major ways that I think we're gonna see the profession change, and we're gonna see where things are going in the future.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time right now. So thank you for that answer. So now pivoting a little bit for some of our younger viewers who are interested in getting into the field, what advice do you have for kids that are interested right now?
So it's funny. I think I think both kids who are looking at, sort of a prospective profession, and then there's sort of non-architects. I think we always focus on the field, right? Like the occupation, the job of architecture. But I think for me, the advice I would give, it's important to look at both the profession and the education that sort of leads up to that profession. I think an architectural or a design education is like this really important, valuable tool in and of itself, because I think it teaches you a way of thinking and a way of approaching the world that that really affects how you work and do things after that, whether you become a practicing architect or not. And then I think that helps you keep an open mind and open up and be aware, I guess, of all the avenues that the skills that you have as a designer or an architect can lead to. There are people who leave architecture school and decide to practice architecture like I have, and it's great. But people who decide to work for government, go into policymaking, become urban planners, people who become furniture designers and product designers. Of course, one of the tools in architects and designers sort of sort of counterparts, I guess, are 3D visualization and that sort of thing. So we see a lot of people who are trained as architects become animators and gaming designers, people who work on film sets becoming production designers. So like I would say, yeah, like really value like architecture education, and then keep an open mind about what sort of fields you can enter, because it's like such an important, valuable skill set to have, and you can literally do anything with it.
Great. So what is one thing you think all aspiring architects, designers should know?
the thing I think is really important, so there are a lot of things that are really important, right? And I think one of the things that I sort of valued early on was just like pure like design skills and being able to sketch and draw and visualize and communicate um, communicate these sort of visions I had, and that stuff is really really important. You can't overstate how important that is. But another thing that I think is really critical about being a good designer or an architect is developing sort of people skills and being comfortable being around all sorts of people and enjoying being around people and understanding sort of what makes them tick and just wanting uh, to be around them and to just enjoy people for people's sake. I think it makes you a more mindful designer and an architect, and it just makes you sort of better better at your job, right? Because this is a people profession, and your clients and the public come to rely on you for the skills and the services that you can provide. But they also want to trust you and want to feel like you understand and get the problems that they're entrusting you with trying to solve.
Very good answer. A little bit of a follow-up to that. Some of our younger audience, they're like, well, I don't know if I can go into it because I'm not good at math. I'm not good at drawing. What would you say to that?
Well, we get that. You get that a lot. Like I think from people, not just kids, but people who aren't, as familiar with the inner workings and the day to day of being an architect. And I would say, yes, like having some a decent understanding of numbers and math is good, but I wouldn't see it as a deal breaker, right? Like it shouldn't you shouldn't feel like not feel like you're as comfortable with math as you'd like to be is a barrier to your entering the profession. Um, I mean, you can you can sort of work around those things, but I think things like being able to communicate with people and understanding people are a lot more important than feeling like you're super facile with numbers. And drawing, I do think is a really really important tool, and that's something you can work on. Like if you don't feel like you're as good at communicating, visually or sketching, that's something you can work at. And I guess the same thing with math, right? Like if it's something that gives you a lot of anxiety, don't feel like you're always gonna be anxious about it or something you're always gonna struggle with. Just sort of embrace it and work at it and practice it, and you'll get better. But certainly don't see those things as barriers to entering the profession.
Great. What do you think kids should know about the design world that they don't know already?
Oh, that's funny. Well, I think it includes a lot of things that I think we aren't often mindful of, right? And then the design world, I think when people look at a lot of sort of lay people or maybe kids, they think about design world in terms of the things they see in magazines, right? Like the big, sort of you know photogenic projects, and those are important. But I think the really critical thing to understand is that the design world includes all sorts of things at every scale. So every decision that gets made that makes that big photogenic project sing and look as attractive as it does, there are all these little minor design decisions that lead up to that. Every little detail that you may not focus on goes into making that thing this beautiful holistic thing that sort of everyone celebrates. So someone sat there and considered every every decision about maybe a brick color, or where that handrail should go, or what material I should use on that surface. What furniture should go here. How do I want this thing to sound? So it's like every sort of big major project includes a lot of smaller decisions that went into it, and a lot of people are involved in making those decisions and informing those things. It's not one big one big vision. There are a lot of voices that go into it, and a lot of small things that go into it as well.
Great. So do you have any other, anything else you want to share with our viewers?
Um, I guess I would just like to say that, hey, this is a really exciting, it's a really exciting profession. It's really fun. It can be challenging, I guess, day to day sometimes, but it can be really rewarding also. And I think it's important to embrace the things that make it rewarding. Like really lean into the fact that this is like it should be a human-centric profession, and it's about serving people and being willing and excited about engaging with your clients and the people who are going to use your projects. You produce work that can really impact people's lives in a great way for a long time. And I think we welcome people into the profession who embrace that. Um, so yeah, and I look forward to hopefully working with and mentoring people who are want to enter the profession and study architecture.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Anthony, for joining us for this week's episode of Interview with an Architect. Join us next week for another installment.
Thank you, Rachel.